In between bass drums, you're dealing with quaver or eighth note hats. They're called eighth notes because there's 8 in a bar. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 2 bass drums, 1 hat. And I call it bass, bass, hat, snare, hat, bass, bass, hat, snare, hat. There's a bass drum in between the first and second stroke. Bass, bass, hat, snare, hat, bass, bass, hat, snare, hat. And this is how it works. Number 1. Then the second one is you got a hat in between the second and third stroke. Bass, hat, bass, snare, hat, bass, snare, hat. So just all the hi-hats are even, and just the in-between bass drum, second and third hi-hat in between the and 2 and 4. Bass, hat, bass, snare, hat, bass, snare, hat. And this is how it works. 2. The third one, we've got a bass drum in between the third and fourth stroke. Bass, hat, snare, bass, hat, bass, hat, snare, bass, hat. The hi-hats are even, they don't change, but the bass drum is smack in between the third and the fourth hi-hat. And this is how it sounds. 3. The fourth one is you got a bass drum in between the fourth and then the next stroke on the hat. Bass, hat, snare, hat, bass, hat, snare, hat, bass, hat, snare, hat, bass, hat, snare, hat, bass. Keeping all the hi-hats even, and then you just jump in and whack a good bass drum smack in between. 4. And then the fifth one is a combination of the first and second. Bass, bass, hat, snare, hat, bass, snare, hat, bass, hat, snare, hat, bass, snare, hat. And this is how it works. 5. The sixth one is a combination of the second and the third. Bass, hat, bass, snare, hat, bass, snare, bass, hat, bass, snare, hat, bass, snare, bass, hat. All the hats are even, basses are in between. 6. And the seventh is a combination of the third and fourth. Bass, hat, snare, bass, hat, snare, hat, bass, snare, bass, snare, hat, bass. And this is how it works. 7. So the eighth one is bass, hat, snare, hat, bass, snare, hat, bass, snare, hat, bass, snare, hat, and this is how it works. 8. The ninth one has bass drums in between, so it's a combination of the second and the fourth one, just before bass, bass, snare, hat, bass, hat, bass, snare, hat, bass, hat, bass, snare. So before the snare, before this bass, with the hat, so they're the in-betweens. The ones with two tails are in-betweens. Strictly speaking, the tail should be pointing the other way, but I'm sure you can work out whether two tails or two lines, they do in fact mean semiquavered. 9. So the 10th one is bass, bass, bass. So there's 3 bass drums, but an in-between still, just like this one here, in between the first and second stroke. Bass, 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 snare, hat, bass, bass, snare, hat, bass, 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 snare, hat, bass, bass, snare, hat. And this is how it works. 10. Bass, hat, snare, bass, hat, hat, bass, snare, hat, bass, hat, snare, bass, hat, hat, bass, snare, hat, and this is how it works. 11. Bass, snare, hat, bass, bass, hat, snare, hat, snare, bass, snare, hat, bass, bass, hat, snare, hat. 12. So this is bass, hat, bass, snare, hat, snare, bass, snare, bass, snare, hat, bass, snare, hat, snare, bass, snare, hat. And this is how it works. 13.